Joseph Dunford. Acting Secretary of the Air Force, Matthew Donovan. Acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, David Pekoski. Acting Director of National Intelligence, Joseph McGuire. Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vogt. Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. The John and Adrian Mars Director of the National Air and Space Museum, Dr. Ellen Stofan.
Center. It's an honor to welcome the National Space Council back to the museum to continue the work of mapping the future of American space exploration, surrounded here by icons of our nation's highest, proudest achievements in space. The Council is ensuring our future achievements are fully empowered by this past achievements. The things that you will be discussing today will one day be enshrined in this museum. And don't forget about us, we need hardware. Last month at our museum in Washington, at the unveiling of Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 spacesuit, Vice President Pence spoke about this generation's renewed commitment to American leadership in human spaceflight. Here at the National Air and Space Museum, we see evidence of that commitment every day. Countless children have stood in this very spot and marveled up at the Space Shuttle Discovery, then turned to their parents, grandparents, or teachers to ask how something so big could fly so high. Our museum is where the country comes to understand its heritage of adventure and discovery and to pass that torch on to new generations. We're at the dawn of a new space age with a challenge to return to the moon and beyond. The Americans who will make those first flights, including the first woman on the moon and the first humans on Mars, were not alive to see our first steps onto another world. We must recapture the energy, scope, and complexity of our first moonshots for those who were not born in time to see it, but who are called on now to repeat it. This summer, the museum celebrated that bold spirit with a program we called Go for the Moon. This was no ordinary commemoration. It involved projecting a full-scale 363-foot Saturn V rocket onto the highest point in the nation's capital, the Washington Monument. It was almost 90 degrees at 9 in the morning on July 16, 1969, when the real Apollo 11 launched in Florida. It was that hot in Washington, D.C. this summer at night. But despite the heat, 500,000 people came out to see our rocket on the National Mall. On the night of the 50th anniversary, we recreated the launch of history's most powerful rocket with full light and sound effects. The ground shook and the air glowed red with the flames from the engines. And looking at the faces of the children in the crowd, you could tell that they felt a connection to that moment in 1969 when, for the first time in human history, the moon was within reach. And for the children who will stand on this spot later today and marvel up at the discovery, the moon is again within their grasp. Earlier this year, Vice President Pence noted that President Kennedy called for an American on the moon by the end of the decade in 1961, well before we knew how to make it happen. It will take that same bold commitment to American ideas and innovation to meet the challenge to return to the moon and onto Mars, and we are grateful to Vice President Pence and the National Space Council for their leadership and support as we work to educate and inspire a new generation of innovators and explorers. It is now my great pleasure to welcome the Chair of the National Space Council and the Vice President of the United States, the Honorable Mike Pence.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stofan. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for your tremendous stewardship and your tremendous leadership. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Ellen Stofan for her outstanding leadership? To all the members of the National Space Council, to our user advisory group, all of whom very quietly came on stage, I think they all deserve a big round of applause. These are extraordinary Americans that are making a difference for American leadership in space. Would you join me in thanking them? And to our gracious host, the Smithsonian Institution, all the men and women here at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, it's a great honor to be with all of you today. Thank you for your patience today. Thank you for your attendance today. And welcome to the 6th meeting of the National Space Council. You know, it was 3 years ago that a candidate for president came alongside his new running mate, and he said to me, you know, this thing called the National Space Council has lain dormant for more than 25 years, and I was wondering if you'd like to follow the tradition of past vice presidents and chair a renewed National Space Council. And I looked at him and I said, would I? So join me in thanking a leader who is committed to securing American leadership on Earth and in the vast expanse of space. Join me in thanking the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump. His leadership has made a difference, and you'll hear about that today. You know, it was nearly 2 years ago, right here at the National Air and Space Museum, that we held the first meeting of the National Space Council. So we could think of no better place to hold our 6th meeting, where we're going to reflect on the progress that we've made and how our administration and the United States is on track in our efforts to expand and renew American leadership in space. And really, I can think of no better time to be here and to celebrate the progress of our renewed leadership, because it was 1 month ago the world paid tribute to 3 extraordinary American astronauts, the crew of Apollo 11, and the 400,000 men and women who stood behind them 50 years ago. It was one small step and one giant leap. And what a great celebration it was. So many of you were a part of it, not only here in our nation's capital, but all across the country. And I have to tell you, it was deeply humbling for me to be able to spend time with many of the men and women and heroes that made that moment possible. That they secured, in a very real sense, American leadership in space. But as we gather here today, we do so recognizing that it's been 47 years since the last American set foot on the moon. In fact, our great shuttle program, including the Space Shuttle Discovery behind me, was grounded nearly a decade ago. And the truth is, as all of you know, for too long, America was content with low Earth orbit and missions focused on the Earth instead of aiming for the stars. But I'm proud to report that under President Trump's leadership, all of that is changing. As the President said in his inaugural address, we stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space. And that's exactly what we're doing. It's true. After 2.5 years under the President's leadership, America is leading in space once again. This President recognizes what the American people have known for more than half a century. And that is that our security, our prosperity, and our very way of life depend on American leadership and American leadership in space. Now, we acknowledge that low Earth orbit is not our final destination, but rather it is a training ground for the infinite frontier of space. And I can assure you the American people are ready for the next chapter in our nation's history in space. So at the President's direction, we've put an end to decades of budget cuts and decline, and we've renewed America's commitment to human space exploration, vowing to go further into space, farther and faster than ever before. That's why in our first year in office, President Trump signed Space Policy Directive 1, making it the national policy of the United States of America to return to the moon and prioritize crewed missions to the lunar surface. SPD-1 marked a watershed moment in America's space enterprise, and with it, the President finally gave NASA the clear direction and clear mission that it needed. As he said, we will return American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use, not only to plant our flag and leave our footprint, but we will go there to establish a foundation for an eventual mission to Mars. Earlier this year, President Trump made it the policy of this administration to return to the moon by 2024 and ensure that the next man and the first woman on the moon will be American astronauts. The Artemis mission has already begun. We're well on our way to making NASA's Moon to Mars mission a reality. You'll hear more about that today. To give NASA the resources they need to accomplish this mission, the President signed into law the agency's largest budget ever. And as we speak, we're working with Congress to add an additional $1.6 billion to support our renewed commitment to human space exploration. The Space Launch System, known as SLS, the world's most powerful rocket, will launch American astronauts toward the moon, will be fully assembled by the end of this year. Last month, we marked the capsule complete on the Orion capsule. It's the spacecraft that we all know will sit on top of the SLS, and it will carry the first crewed ship designed to deep space exploration in a half a century. And just last week, we announced that the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, will lead development of our new lunar lander. And working with Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, we will ensure that a new generation of astronauts have the state-of-the-art vessel to reach the lunar surface safely and return by 2024. We're going to get it done. In fact, Administrator Bridenstine told me that with strong congressional support that we've got, we can actually start bending metal on the lander in the next year, whatever that means. I'm proud to report also we've empowered our commercial partners. In recent months, SpaceX successfully docked its automated Crew Dragon capsule at the International Space Station. Blue Origin tested engines for its own lunar lander, and Boeing is working hard to launch its first crewed vehicle by the end of this year. And working with our industry leaders, before the year is out, the United States will once again send American astronauts into space on American rockets from American soil. So we're making great progress, but we have new ambitions. In this still new century, America is not only going to return to the moon, but we're going to return there with new objectives. Because unlike a half century ago, this time, our objective will be to establish a permanent presence on the lunar surface, and from there we will develop the capabilities to journey to the red planet of Mars. In order for us to take the next big leap toward the Martian surface, you all here know that we have to demonstrate that we can live on the moon for months and even years. We have to learn how to make use of all available resources to sustain human life and all our activities in space, including by mining the vast quantities of life-sustaining water that's frozen in ice on our lunar poles. And once we return to the moon, we're going to develop the technologies to live and thrive in a multi-month expedition at its south pole. Using what we learn on the moon will bring us closer to the day, as the President said, that American astronauts will plant the stars and stripes on the surface of Mars. In fact, within the last year, American technology touched down once again on Martian soil, as all of the world witnessed the InSight mission touch down and marked our 8th successful landing on Mars. And even now, the men and women of NASA are hard at work identifying those areas of the red planet that would be most suitable for human exploration. We're not only planning to go, we're preparing to go. And much like the Apollo missions, when our space program relied on tools and methods that didn't exist when the mission was established, achieving our ambitious goals will depend on innovative technologies, including those that our panelists are going to talk about today. But unlike during Apollo, this time, our efforts will not rely entirely on government action. Instead, we will go forward into that bright future with the strong support of our private partners and international allies. Already, NASA is working with industry leaders to develop plans for the Lunar Gateway, a critical outpost and refueling station that will help us develop the technologies, test the systems, and train the astronauts for the first ever crewed journey to Mars. Our Moon to Mars mission is on track, and America is leading in human space exploration again. Don't you doubt it. As we'll also talk about today, under the President's leadership, we've also unleashed America's commercial space industry as never before. As the President said memorably not long ago, rich guys love rockets. And we've taken steps to make it possible for American entrepreneurs to invest and to help America develop the technologies that will carry American leadership into space. As Secretary Ross will no doubt reflect again today, we're streamlining the licensing regimes that oversee launch, re-entry, and new operations in space. We're removing unnecessary regulations that have increased cost and stifled innovation. All of that's happened over the last 2.5 years. We've encouraged a more stable and orderly space environment by developing the world's first comprehensive space traffic management policy. And as we've restored confidence in the opportunities of space, we've helped drive incredible economic growth. Just 2 years ago, the satellite industry alone generated some $350 billion in revenue. And studies predict that number will increase to more than $1 trillion annually in the next 2 decades. And more than ever, space is recognized as the industry of the future. In the first half of this year, we've seen almost as much invested in space companies as we did in the entire year before. In fact, in the last decade, more than $22 billion has been invested in nearly 500 different space companies. And I'm proud to say that the majority of those investments have been made in American space businesses. America is leading in public and private investment in space. But as we all know, as we lead in human space exploration, as we lead in American innovation and entrepreneurship in space, we also must lead in security. And for the sake of our security, both here on earth and in the heavens above, at President Trump's direction, we are working with Congress as we speak to stand up a new branch of our armed forces. And soon Congress will approve and the President will sign the 6th branch of the armed forces of the United States Space Force. As the President has said, we all recognize, it's been frankly true for decades, in his words, space is a war-fighting domain. The United States Space Force will ensure that our nation is prepared to defend our people, to defend our interests, and defend our values in the vast expanse of space and here on the earth with the technologies that will support our common defense from the vast reaches of outer space. Next week, we will formally stand up the new Unified Combatant Command. It'll be known as the United States Space Command, and I'm pleased to announce that we will recognize its new leader, 4-star Air Force General John Raymond will be the first leader of the United States Space Command. Thank you, General. And before I move on from General Raymond, let me mention another general is here with us today. General Joe Dunford is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has served this nation throughout his long career in uniform with extraordinary distinction. He has played a critical role in ensuring the national defense of the United States, and he will be concluding his duties as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the months ahead. And would you all mind getting on your feet and just showing how much we appreciate the extraordinary life and career and leadership of General Joe Dunford. Thank you, General. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your leadership, particularly on the matters pertaining American leadership in space. It is a historic contribution, and I know the President feels as I do that we would not be at this historic moment without your leadership and your support. Later this morning, we're going to hear more about our administration's progress toward a new unified defense agreement to defend America's national security space assets and also ensure our collective defense. But for all that we've accomplished, the greatest triumphs of American leadership in space still lie ahead, and you'll hear about those plans today. The National Space Council today will send new policy recommendations to the President that will help drive even greater cooperation between our government, our commercial partners, and like-minded nations across the world, nations that share our values of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. We will build on the success of the International Space Station by working with our friends and allies to support a moon landing in 2024, to develop sustainable long-term lunar surface operations, and to build the spacecraft that will carry us to Mars. We'll also continue to unleash the creative powers of America's commercial space enterprise. This council will recommend today steps that will encourage innovation and ensure that American companies have the level playing field they need to compete and win in space. And we'll continue to transform NASA into a leaner, more accountable, and more agile organization. Isn't that right, Jim? Yes, sir. Yeah, good. We're going to make it easier than ever to recruit and retain the world's brightest scientists, engineers, and managers, and we're going to hit our goals, and we're going to make new American history in space. You know, President Trump tasked the National Space Council with reigniting and reinvigorating the American space program, and I'm humbled and proud at the same time to say that's exactly what this team has done. And that's what we're going to continue to do with the support of so many of you gathered here today. As President Trump said, in his words, it is America's destiny to be the leader amongst nations on our adventure into the great unknown. And that's why the National Space Council was reconstituted, and that's what brought us here today. And while the tasks before us involve hardship and hazard, sacrifice and perseverance, we know what the men and women of Apollo 11 knew 50 years ago, and that is simply this, that Americans can accomplish anything we set our minds to, and America will lead the world back into the vast expanse of space. So thank you all for being here today. We're grateful to the members of the National Space Council, our advisory group, all the experts and industry leaders who are joining us here today. And I look very much forward to our dialogue and our discussion and the support that I see in this room, the support that I hear from not only people involved in the great space enterprise across this country, but from everyday Americans from every walk of life convinces me that we have only just begun to renew American leadership in space. So thank you all. Thank you all for your support. Thank you for your presence here today. Let's get to work. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your kind attention. We're going to get right down to business. We are joined today here at the Udvar-Hazy Center. And let's give the Smithsonian another round of applause, will you? This is a spectacular place that fires the imagination of Americans every day. In addition to all the members of the National Space Council, we're joined by a number of distinguished guests in the audience, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us today. It's hard for me to look around this room and not recognize virtually everyone in every seat, and yet this is just a small sampling, isn't it, Jim, of the incredible leadership of America's public and private space enterprise. So give yourselves a round of applause. We are grateful that you're here. Today's meeting of the National Space Council will provide updates from our council members on ongoing work to help secure American leadership in space. We're going to hear from scientists and industry leaders about innovations that will drive the next era of human space exploration. We're going to discuss a new set of recommendations, as I mentioned in my formal remarks. To begin with, I'd like to ask Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar, who's President and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, to bring us some updates on our user advisory group's activities since their last meeting in March. Mary Lynn, we appreciate your leadership, your extraordinary career. Thank you for bringing your experience to this. And join me in thanking all the members of the user advisory group, many of which are here on the front row, for their contributions to the National Space Council. Thank you all. Would you all mind standing up? User advisory group members, take a bow. Great job. Dr. Dittmar, quick report on the User Advisory Group.
Mr. Vice President and distinguished members of the National Space Council, thank you for inviting me to provide an update on the activities of the Users Advisory Group. As you all know, the objectives, scope of activities, and description of duties of the UAG is defined in statute, executive order, and the charter of the National Space Council Users Advisory Group, dated December 6, 2017, signed by the acting NASA administrator. While the UAG is administratively chartered and supported under NASA, the UAG functions exclusively in an independent advisory capacity to the National Space Council, reporting to you through the National Space Council Executive Secretary. Mr. Vice President, you have repeatedly challenged the UAG to function as a think tank for the National Space Council, in addition to the advisory role spelled out in its title. It is intended to be a conduit for new ideas. It also offers sometimes differing but hopefully constructive commentary on conventional wisdom, which, we often note, is sometimes too conventional and not nearly wise enough. Organizationally, the UAG is divided into 6 subcommittees that reflect precisely the priorities that you and our chairman, retired Admiral James Ellis, discussed prior to its formation. In the months since our meeting with you in Huntsville in March, we've gathered to review and scope the specific taskings that you gave us earlier this year. The Exploration and Discovery Subcommittee, led by retired General Lester Lyles, is structuring a one-time review of NASA's newly named Artemis program, focusing on its architecture, technical planning, organizational structure, and leadership. The fact that General Lyles also capably chairs the NASA Advisory Council will ensure that the UAG draws on the work of that NASA committee while offering independent advice to you where appropriate. As you know, Admiral Ellis is chairman of the National Security Subcommittee and leads a very capable group with the required security clearances. Their focus, also reflective of National Space Council interest, has been on the organizational structure and functionality of the emerging Space Force. As part of their review, last month, they received a high-level classified briefing from the Department of Defense and the intelligence community on the process and progress of implementation planning in anticipation of pending congressional action. I and my colleague Eric Stallmer, president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, co-chair the Economic Development and Industrial Base Subcommittee. As you directed, we are first assessing how best to manage space-related spectrum issues, including both process and content in this critical area. We are also considering additional recommendations for regulatory process reform and partnerships to move beyond NASA in accelerating the economic development of low Earth orbit and beyond. Retired Colonel, veteran astronaut, and Space Shuttle pilot and mission commander Pam Melroy leads the Technology and Innovation Subcommittee. The committee is focused on assessing the status of the NASA Space Exploration Technology Roadmap, specifying space technologies to be explored, alternatives to be compared, and timelines that must be met. The results of that review will determine whether additional support to the subcommittee from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is required. Retired Colonel Eileen Collins, renowned space shuttle pilot and mission commander, chairs the UAG Subcommittee on Outreach and Education. I will say more about outreach efforts in a minute. On the education and training side, her committee is committed to developing actionable recommendations to enhance space-related and engineering education at all levels. She has innovatively begun to draw on speakers on STEM from the National Committee of State Legislators and from universities with NASA involvement to gain a broader perspective on education and workforce issues. The final group, the Space Policy and International Engagement Subcommittee, is led by Dr. David Wolf, astronaut, spacewalker, medical doctor, electrical engineer, and your fellow Hoosier. The committee's broad remit will include review of both the current and evolving national space policy, as well as the guidelines, behavioral norms, and technical standards affecting international space cooperation and deconfliction. We have followed the successful outcome of the 62nd session of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and have planned a session with the Department of State to ensure that we understand the administration's space goals and objectives in the diplomatic arena. Separately, as the Users Advisory Group to the National Space Council enters its second year, we are reviewing the organizational charter for potential updating so as to better define the organizational structure, required resources, and to streamline work processes. We believe and know from discussions with you that you agree that an ongoing and active role of the UAG is important to the success of the administration's effort to marshal a whole-of-government strategy to U.S. space. Finally, as I noted earlier, mindful that we were impaneled to represent all users of space, members of the Users Advisory Group have participated in major domestic and international space events over the last several months, many of them in conjunction with a wonderful nationwide celebration of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, which referenced earlier. We will continue to serve as the eyes and ears of your National Space Council, seeking input and ideas, issues and innovations, scientists and engineers, students and teachers, experienced aerospace veterans at all levels, and importantly, the up-and-coming new generation of space professionals. Mr. Vice President, on behalf of the Users Advisory Group and its chairman, Admiral Ellis, thank you for this update opportunity. Wherever we go, at home or abroad, and with whomever we speak, we see a new energy, a new vitality in the space community. We appreciate the focus that you and the National Space Council have brought to our nation's role in space, and we look forward to continuing to support your efforts and to our shared contribution to the future of the nation's space enterprise. I'll be pleased to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Dittmar. And I don't see him through the bright lights, but Admiral Jim Ellis is the chairman of the User Advisory Group. I don't know if he's with us today, but you can give him a big round of applause as well. He's, you can tell from that report the great work that the Admiral and the whole team are doing. Questions of the panel of the User Advisory Group? Anything having to do with the committees, the reports that were made? Will give us an opportunity. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dittmar. Thank you, and thanks to all the members of the User Advisory Group for outstanding work. Now we're going to move to some reports by members of the National Space Council, I'm going to recognize our Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, who has been involved in working on space traffic management, regulatory reform, and is almost as excited about American innovation in space as the President and me. So join me in thanking the Secretary of Commerce for his great leadership.
Thank you, Vice President Pence, for the opportunity to update the National Space Council on space activities at the Department of Commerce. Last year, there were 114 government and private space launches worldwide, the first time in 3 decades that number exceeded 100. U.S. had 31 launches, including a record number of commercial launches, but China had 39. More than 80 countries have now entered the space industry, often playing under different rules from what we have. These countries realize that space is a strategic industry that creates a highly technical workforce with spin-off technologies and economic growth. This was evident at the Paris Air Show, which highlighted U.S. leadership, but also made clear the substantial efforts of foreign government-backed entities to surpass us. 75% of space industry revenues are now commercial. We intend to keep the United States as the flag of choice as the global space industry moves from $415 billion of revenues to $1 trillion within the next 20 years. Commerce Department is actively pursuing the space traffic management goals outlined in Space Policy Directive 3. Our strong partnership with the Department of Defense will modernize space situational awareness capabilities. Mark Daly, a senior executive with experience in both defense and space commerce, leads the Commerce Department's SSA landing team at the 18th Space Control Squadron at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Our joint SSA efforts will help avoid the destructive impact of space debris, even as space activities grow more complex and global in nature. In response to our April 2019 RFI, more than 50 academic and industry partners submitted creative ideas to limit the creation of new space debris through satellite design, improved SSA, and early mission deorbit. The Commerce Department's role is critically important given the plans of commercial industry to launch thousands of mass-produced satellites in constellations. Commerce is developing an open architecture data repository for space debris information. This will allow us to provide conjunction notifications to the U.S. and global commercial space industries in the near future. The new repository will incorporate private sector innovations to track and avoid space debris, and that in turn will facilitate new commercial space services. Under Space Policy Directive 2, to eliminate or streamline regulations, we are revising remote sensing and export control rules. We have received extensive feedback from U.S. companies in the fast-developing and extremely competitive global market for remote sensing. Our immediate goal is a new draft rule that encourages domestic innovation while ensuring global competitiveness and market leadership of American companies. Commerce is working with the State Department and other agencies to review public comments on our March proposed rule so that we can issue a final rule this fall. At an industry day I hosted in April, we discussed the need to maintain export controls with some countries while streamlining them for others. Within the Commerce Department, we have reestablished the Office of Space Commerce that had been dormant for decades. It is the only U.S. government entity charged with pursuing the unique interests of the commercial space industry. The commercial industry has said repeatedly that it needs an advocate, a one-stop shop in its dealings with both U.S. government and foreign governments. So we continue to work within the administration and with Congress to establish a Bureau of Space Commerce that will give commerce the resources needed to execute the Space Council's directives. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. You can give the Secretary of Commerce a round of applause. That is an extraordinary amount of work. Wilbur, thank you. Thank you so much for your tremendous efforts, and I want to offer my congratulations. You mentioned the work in April, but the Space Enterprise Summit that the Department of Commerce co-hosted in June, I think you've also spoken about, and I hope that our private industry partners see the tremendous commitment by the President in our Department of Commerce to enlivening private investment and development. I'll ask members of the panel to throw a question at the Secretary, but a quick question. The new commercial remote sensing regulations are being developed at Commerce. Can you speak about when those will be completed or amplify the points you made?
Yes, we think by the end of October we should have that work completed.
Okay, outstanding. Any other questions from members of the panel for the Secretary of Commerce? Okay, we're very grateful, Wilbur. Thank you so very much, and all of your remarks will be included in the record as prepared. Next, I'd like to recognize the administrator of NASA, Jim Bridenstine, who has become a great friend of mine. He is a great champion for American leadership in space. He was given a charge by the President of the United States to return Americans to the moon by 2024 and make sure the first astronauts on Mars are Americans. And Jim, I know I speak on behalf of the President when I appreciate the energy you've brought to this effort. We should not be terribly surprised that a Navy F-18 pilot was ready to move out and move out quickly. But join me in thanking the administrator of NASA for his tremendous efforts. And Jim, look forward to your report to the Space Council.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. It is an honor to serve in this position. Just yesterday, I was at the White House briefing members of the National Security Council on our plans to go to the moon and on to Mars. And while I was there, Victoria Coates brought in a box of M&Ms. And I said, and by the way, these aren't just M&Ms, these are President Trump M&Ms, not just any M&Ms here. And I said, now, what is that all about? And she said, M&M, Moon and Mars. And so she said, make sure you show this to everybody and let them know we're going to the moon because we are going to Mars. And the President has been very clear. We will put an American flag on Mars. So, Mr. Vice President, you can have the M&Ms. A couple of things that I think are important to note. Sir, since you I guess, importantly gave us that charge back in March, a number of things have changed. And I'll just kind of go through one at a time. As you mentioned earlier today, low Earth orbit. That is a great opportunity for us to figure out how to do things commercially. We have commercial crew on the brink of being ready. We have commercial resupply, already resupplying the International Space Station. And recently we announced that we have some objectives to achieve a more commercial nature in low Earth orbit, starting with creating both the demand side and the supply side. So on the demand side, we're looking at really two lines of effort that we believe could have major breakthroughs for basically activities in low Earth orbit, starting with industrialized biomedicine and then advanced materials. Those two lines of effort, if we can do experiment after experiment, iterating one after another, I believe in the next 3 to 7 years we can have a strong breakthrough that will result in demand for access to low Earth orbit. Now that's going to take an effort and a change of philosophy on how we utilize the International Space Station. It is also true, Mr. Vice President, that just a few short months ago we announced that we're doing things to increase supply of activities in low Earth orbit. We are going to make available commercial crew seats for industry so that they can take space, whether it's researchers or manufacturers or even tourists, to the International Space Station. We also want to make the International Space Station itself available for more people. So we're looking at additional habitation using the port for commercial operations on the International Space Station. And each of these activities will increase supply, while at the same time working really hard to generate demand with an eventual effort. And of course, we've got procurements underway that we are interested in seeing what industry can provide, but we want to have free flyers in low Earth orbit that are commercial in nature. So these are things that we are striving to in low Earth orbit. But remember why we are commercializing, and I think this is important for everybody on the National Space Council. Why are we commercializing? Because we want to use the resources that the taxpayers give to us to go to the moon, following Space Policy Directive 1, to go sustainably, to go with commercial partners and international partners, to utilize the resources on the moon, the water ice, Mr. Vice President, that you talked about on the South Pole. Use that as life support. How do we live for months on another planetary body so that ultimately we can take all of that knowledge onto Mars? So what we do in low Earth orbit matters because we want to go to the moon and onto Mars. And interestingly, just last week, I was at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. And I know, Mr. Vice President, you have been keenly focused on the SLS rocket. And I will tell you what I saw there was eye-watering. We say the words that it's 4/5 complete. I would say that it's well over 90% complete at this point. The engine section was the long pole in the tent. It was on the critical path. We removed the engine section from the critical path. We integrated the rest of the rocket horizontally. It is a beautiful thing to see in the horizontal. And this week and next week, we will be integrating the engine section into the rest of the rocket. And by the end of this year, as you correctly said earlier, we're going to move that rocket out of the factory and we're going to test it. And I will tell you, yes. So it was exciting to see that. And I will tell you, Mr. Vice President, not just the first SLS, but the hardware for the second SLS is already being put into place and will start to be assembled very soon as well. So very exciting times down at the Michoud Assembly Facility. And as you were there just last month, Mr. Vice President, when you announced the Orion crew capsule complete with the European service module, we are very close to shipping that up to Plumbrook Station, where it will be tested, thermal vacuum testing as well as EMI testing. So all of those very exciting activities are underway. We also, since the last National Space Council, we have gone under contract for the first element of the gateway, the power and propulsion element, solar electric propulsion for that reusable command module in orbit around the moon for the next 15 years. So that's a great development as well. And by the way, the reason that was able to go so fast, Mr. Vice President, is because of the charge to be ready by 2024 to land not just the next man, but also the first woman on the south pole of the moon. That charge is really what changed the dynamic to make that go so fast, that acquisition element. On that gateway, we're moving as fast as we can, rapid acquisition of what we call a mini-hab, just a small habitation module attached to the power and propulsion element. That's not the long-term solution, but that's what's going to help us get our astronauts from the Orion into a lander and land on the surface of the moon. Last week we announced that that lander that I'm talking about is going to be managed out of the Marshall Space Flight Center. And it is absolutely true, Mr. Vice President, the Johnson Space Center is going to be very involved in that. Certainly when it comes to environmental control and life support systems, there is no place on the planet better than the Johnson Space Center. When it comes to human-to-machine interface, no place better than Johnson as well. And of course, when it comes to mission planning in the astronaut office, a lot of capability, both at Marshall and at Johnson, to get this national project underway. And as you are aware, Mr. Vice President, in the last months since the March National Space Council, we also named the program Artemis. And I think that is a significant milestone. It was you who wrote the speech yourself, and I was there when you did it, and you said, we're going to put the first woman on the moon. And I will tell you that has energized so many people, my daughter included, who is 11 years old. She claims she wants to be a teacher right now, but she is certainly excited about landing a woman on the moon. And I like to say 50 years ago we had Apollo, and it just so happens that in Greek mythology, Apollo had a twin sister. Her name was Artemis. She was the goddess of the moon, and this time when we go to the moon, we go with a very diverse, highly qualified astronaut corps that includes women, and it is long overdue. So we are very excited about that. Well said. Well said. And then lastly, I think it's important to remember the moon to Mars. When we think about what we're doing next, the reason the gateway is so important is that it is absolutely a gateway to the surface of the moon, and we want to do long durations on the surface of the moon using the gateway. It is also evolvable. It is an opportunity for us to take humans deeper into space than we've ever gone before in human history, and in fact, that is our ship to get to Mars. And by the way, if we have the right investments today with advanced propulsion, I know we're going to hear maybe a little bit about nuclear thermal propulsion, about advanced propulsion and the ability to do entry, descent, and landing with 20 metric ton payloads into the Martian atmosphere and onto the Martian surface. These are investments that are not much more than what we're already spending, and we can put together a really robust Mars plan in keeping with the direction to put an American flag on Mars. So, Mr. Vice President, things have changed since March, and we are moving rapidly under your direction and the direction of President Trump. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks for that great report, and mostly thanks for your energetic and enthusiastic leadership of the President's vision for space. And I'm going to take this box of M&Ms back to the President right after you sign it. He'll know even better today that you got the message. It's M&M. That's worth remembering. Dr. Calvin Drogemeyer is the Director of the Office of Science and Technology. The Administrator just mentioned our efforts to update the approval process for launching space nuclear power sources, and Dr. Drogemeyer has a report for us on that. Give us some words on progress. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you today. As we embark on that new generation of space missions that you so eloquently described in your remarks, and as Administrator Bridenstine has said, this time we go to stay. And the challenge here is achieving a persistent human presence in space and on other worlds, that is, staying there, will require the development and application of a wide range of advanced technologies, including lightweight and long-lasting energy sources that can support human life and exploration activities in the most austere and inhospitable environments. Now, over many decades, as we will hear from Mr. Jeviden of BWX, NASA has relied on space nuclear systems on the Moon, on Mars, and in the outer solar system, and also for other missions where alternative power sources have been inadequate. Some of these environments are far too dark for solar power, or they're too far away to carry sufficient supplies of chemical fuels. In the dawning new era of American space exploration, we just heard about exploration into deep space, nuclear power sources will remain critical to the fullest realization of our scientific and exploration objectives. Now, for modest power needs, radioisotopic thermal generators, which are essentially nuclear batteries, can use the energy of radioactive decay to generate electricity for even decades. But for higher power needs, small nuclear reactors can provide the heating, electricity, and also spacecraft propulsion needs. So as we look forward and we also look outward, we must ensure that America can safely develop nuclear space systems and enhance our ability for space exploration, our operational capabilities, and also the potential for increased commercial space activities, as Administrator Bridenstine just mentioned. Now, over a year ago, OSTP, the Office of Science Technology Policy, began reviewing existing nuclear space launch policy. And as I reported at this Council's March meeting in Huntsville, that OSTP review led to the creation of an interagency working group co-chaired by OSTP and our colleagues at the National Space Council. Now, that working group's mandate was to develop recommendations for the Space Council to establish updated and risk-informed processes for launching space nuclear systems that are funded or licensed by the federal government. Now, our primary objective here is to ensure that rigorous and effective nuclear safety analysis and review are conducted prior to the launch of any space nuclear system. And in doing that, we want to leverage past experience wherever we can. And to that end, we must provide clear guidelines to help mission planners and launch approval authorities ensure that launch safety is maintained. We also want to ensure a positive response, a positive safety analysis and launch authorization process that is forward-looking. We think about the future that allows the federal government, as we just heard, the private sector to effectively use space nuclear systems as we return to the moon and we venture far beyond. And finally, we seek to strengthen the existing process for launching space nuclear systems in ways that will better ensure rigorous, risk-informed safety assessment without excessive redundancy or wasted time and cost. So at the Council's urging, since last March, we have continued these review activities, Mr. Vice President. In close cooperation with the National Security Council, we have now finalized a set of recommendations that we believe meet the objectives I just outlined. We ask the Council approve these recommendations for updating the existing process for the launch of spacecraft containing space nuclear systems. And in closing, I'd like to reiterate a point I made at our last meeting, and namely that ensuring a rigorous launch safety process is essential to using space nuclear systems. But we can't stop there. We must not stop there. Moving forward, we must also focus on ensuring that we sustain the skills here in America and that we also develop the technologies needed to provide space nuclear systems that are ready to propel as well as power future American spacecraft. I look forward to working with all of you in implementing this and other policy initiatives that will be necessary for sustaining and strengthening American leadership in space. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for your leadership and for your support. Thank you, sir.
We're going to move on to national security issues in a moment. I'm going to ask other members of the panel to submit your reports in writing. With one exception, Stephen Bradbury is the General Counsel of the Department of Transportation, and the President and I couldn't be more grateful to Secretary Elaine Chao for the energetic efforts that DOT has made to update regulations regarding space launch, and with our commitment to invigorating and continuing to see the private space enterprise develop, I wanted to recognize Stephen Bradbury for a quick update on Department of Transportation's activities. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, members of the Space Council, and distinguished guests. On behalf of Secretary Chao, I'm pleased to update the Council on the Department of Transportation's efforts to streamline the licensing of commercial space launches and reentries, and on DOT's activities regarding satellite-based navigation. First, on April 15th of this year, in accordance with the President's Space Policy Directive 2, the Department of Transportation, through the FAA, published a notice of proposed rulemaking for a major streamlining of FAA's commercial space launch and reentry regulations. This proposal represents a great deal of work by many people at the FAA and in the Office of the Secretary, and it was produced in near record time. It was developed with input from experts in the FAA, the commercial space industry, and other departments and agencies across the federal government. Consistent with the President's instructions, the proposed rule would replace outdated prescriptive requirements with more flexible performance-based criteria. It would allow us to license different types of commercial space operations and vehicles through a single streamlined set of procedures, and it would dramatically reduce the size and complexity of the FAA's commercial space licensing regulations. Now, DOT has received substantive comments on the proposed rule from dozens of companies, organizations, and individuals, including 15 submissions asking more than 100 clarifying questions, which the FAA has endeavored to address in the public rulemaking record. It's obvious the proposed rule has generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions. To allow for greater input, the department extended the public comment period to 126 days, and it just closed yesterday, August 19th. Also, in response to industry requests for face-to-face input, the FAA held a series of meetings with individual commercial space operators and their representatives. FAA honored all requests and met with representatives from Blue Origin, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Virgin Orbit, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, United Launch Alliance, and the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. DOT published a synopsis of these sessions in the public docket. The FAA is digesting the comments and information we've received and will be hard at work over the coming months to address concerns and consider potential revisions to improve the final rule. We're committed to achieving a licensing framework that enables flexibility and innovation in operations, including, where appropriate, by relying on advisory circulars and on methods of compliance developed by operators in lieu of prescriptive rules. Our goal is to publish a final rule by early fall of next year. We're confident this rulemaking will bolster America's industrial base and leadership in the commercial space sector through a smarter, more efficient licensing process, one that lowers the burden and costs of regulatory compliance while ensuring protection of life, property, and national security. Now let me turn briefly to satellite-based navigation. Under National Security Presidential Directive 39, issued in December 2004, the United States is committed to developing, maintaining, and modernizing the Global Positioning System, or GPS, and other satellite-based navigation systems, including backup capabilities in the event of a disruption of GPS. A recent study funded by the Department of Commerce found that GPS has enabled more than $1.4 trillion in economic benefits since 1983, and that a 30-day loss of GPS could cause $30 billion in economic harm and have serious safety of life implications. NSPD 39 gives DOT lead responsibility over the full range of civil uses of GPS, and along with DOD, it makes DOT co-chair of the National Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Timing Executive Committee. Through this PNT-XCOM, we're working closely with DHS and other federal departments and agencies to address policy and technical issues, including the security and resilience of GPS receivers. In light of the critical importance of GPS, DOT has asked for submissions from technology vendors interested in providing GPS backup technologies, and we're now organizing field demonstrations of those technologies. Another way to protect GPS service is real-time monitoring of satellite signals to ensure they meet the necessary performance standards, and we're providing funding to the Air Force to support that monitoring. And working closely with the Commerce Department's NTIA and the FCC, DOT conducted a GPS-adjacent band study to measure levels of tolerance and interference from adjacent band radio frequency systems. The study results show that we need strong, consistent policies to ensure RF protection for satellite-based navigation. Let me close by emphasizing that for the Secretary and all of us at the Department of Transportation, our participation in supporting the objectives of the National Space Council is among our highest priorities. By coordinating the efforts of all the members of the Space Council, we can achieve tremendous benefits for the American people and our national economy. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Great report, Steve. Give the Secretary our best. Okay? Great, and I can attest to the Secretary's enthusiasm, and we're very, very grateful for the efforts. One last tap before we go to national security. We actually asked the Deputy Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, to be here. The Department of Energy is actually not a part of the National Space Council, but it's just doing so much important work in this space. We wanted Secretary Perry and your team to be represented here. So to the Deputy Secretary. Dan, maybe you could summarize your testimony, and then we'll move into national security. But
sure.
Give a round of applause to the Department of Energy. They've really been leaning in on this as well. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the invitation to share a few thoughts with the Space Council. It's a personal honor for me to be here with such a distinguished group of individuals who are continuing to work on America's resurgence on the next great frontier. Because this is my first participation with one of your meetings, I'll keep my comments at a very high level, and I think I've provided with each of you with a summary of the Department's historical contributions to the space program. I want to be clear, Mr. Vice President, that the Department sees space as a very important and strategic focus for our department. DOE is your partner in innovation, in exploration, and in excellence. Our predecessor organization, the Atomic Energy Commission, was a key collaborator during the Apollo missions, and we are eager to join you in returning Americans to the moon, establishing a permanent base there, and then developing the technologies that are needed to send us to Mars and far beyond. Secretary Perry likes to say that given the breadth of our efforts, DOE stands for the Department of Everything. And there's a lot of truth to that, there's no question. DOE's 17 national laboratories discovered dark energy. We helped kickstart the development of the World Wide Web. We accelerated America's ongoing energy revolution, and perhaps most importantly for today's conversation, we powered the spacecraft that explore other planets. So I would argue that DOE also stands for the Department of Exploration. We're proud to have partnered with NASA and other members of the Space Council in a number of important endeavors. For almost 60 years, scientists at our national laboratories have built the RTG, the radioisotopic thermoelectric generator that was mentioned by Dr. Drogemeyer just a few minutes ago. Those have powered the deep space missions like Pioneer and Voyager, Pathfinder, Curiosity and Cassini, and New Horizons. We've provided detectors and sensors for studying Earth and space, and our user facilities engaged in a large range of space-related research, from modeling plasmas and testing materials for radiation hardness to analyzing comet and asteroid samples. Last year, we joined NASA in the iTech Cycle 2 Forum, an event devoted to solving tough energy challenges here on Earth and in space. And we collaborated on the Krusty experiment, which is a bit of a strange acronym. It stands for Kilowatt Reactor Using Stirling Technology. But despite the funny acronym, under this project, we demonstrated heat conversion concepts that will provide the design basis for fission power systems on the surface of Mars. The effort was so successful that in May it received the Gears of Government President's Award for making a profound difference in the lives of American people. Today we're working with NASA on a number of major initiatives to enable nuclear power space exploration over the next decade, and these include powering the Mars 2020 rover and developing the Dragonfly rotorcraft, which in the 2030s will explore Saturn's moon Titan. We're also exploring other frontiers which may be of importance to the space exploration, and those are exascale computing and artificial intelligence. Our laboratories are home to many of the world's fastest supercomputers, including 4 of the top 10 and the world's fastest. And we're currently working on developing 3 exascale machines that will launch us into the next generation of computing power. AI technologies at our national laboratories are already being used for many applications, from cybersecurity to better treatments for cancer and traumatic brain injury. We look forward to applying these capabilities to the many challenges that come with deep space exploration. But by working with our interagency partners, private industry, Secretary Ross, and members of the Space Council, we can push the boundaries. We can overcome greater challenges. We can dream bigger, and we can reach further. I'm confident that we'll see more spacecraft exploring the great frontier, and they will be enabled by the Department of Energy, and they will be destined for greatness. It is our sincere desire to be of service to you in your service to our nation. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Dan. Great job. Well done. Thank you so very much. We're going to shift to national security, then we'll have our panel forward. And I would encourage members of the Space Council, take a look at the recommendations that we will be certifying by acclamation in the course of our meeting today, as my duties will take me back to the White House here with a departure in about 40 minutes. So we'll work through that, but if there are questions related to our recommendations, we encourage you to look into them. Moving to national security, we are honored to be joined today on his 5th day on the job by General Joe McGuire. He is the acting director of national intelligence, but he brings with him an extraordinary background military service and service to the country. So join me in welcoming Joe McGuire to the National Space Council. Joe, good to have you.
Mr. Vice President and members of the Council, thank you for allowing me to update you on the threats we face in space and where we are in the tasking issued by the President, directing the intelligence community and the Department of Defense to look for ways to increase our effectiveness of space operations. As everyone here this morning knows, the U.S. and our allies have vital interest in space, including military, commercial, and scientific. However, these interests are increasingly threatened as China and Russia developed and field destructive weapons, placing U.S. and allied space systems at risk. Some examples. China has deployed a ground-based missile intended to target and destroy satellites in low Earth orbit. Russia has a similar system in development that will likely be operational within the next few years. China is pursuing weapons capable of destroying satellites up to geosynchronous Earth orbit, and Russia has fielded a ground-based laser weapon which could blind or damage our space-based optical sensors. In addition, China and Russia have established dedicated space forces. Both countries view the capability to attack space systems and services as part of their broader efforts to deter or defeat an adversary in combat. In short, the threat to U.S. and allied space systems continues to grow unabated. Turning to the President's tasking, in February 19th of this year, the President signed Space Policy Directive 4, which established the requirement for Space Force. The directives also stated that the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence shall create and enhance mechanisms for collaboration between the Department of Defense and the United States intelligence community in order to increase unity of effort and effectiveness of our space operations. In response to this presidential directive, the intelligence community and the Department of Defense leadership created a working group consisting of representatives from 14 organizations in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. This team generated over 50 recommendations for how DoD and the IC can increase collaboration and improve our space operations posture. The best of those recommendations are being concluded in a report that will be presented to the President, which is in final coordination and review. I will summarize the highlights. For years, there have been debates about how the NRO and military space organizations could be better integrated. Early in this task, we recognized that the proposed establishment of U.S. Space Command provides us with the opportunity to finally determine the appropriate level of integration between the intelligence community and DoD to ensure effective space operations. I'm pleased to tell you that after months of analysis and deliberations, the intelligence community and the Department of Defense have agreed to align U.S. Space Command and the NRO into a new Unified Defense Concept of Operations at the National Space Defense Center. As part of U.S. Space Command, the National Space Defense Center is a joint DoD intelligence community organization and will become the center of gravity for defending our vital interest in space. For the first time, there will be a unified structure that fully integrates intelligence community and Department of Defense space defense plans, authorities, and capabilities to ensure seamless execution of space defense systems. Furthermore, should conflict extend to space, the NRO will take direction from the commander of U.S. Space Command and execute defensive operations based on a jointly developed playbook and informed by a series of exercises and war games. I want to commend Space Command and the NRO leadership teams for their thoughtful and innovative work to develop this new approach and assure this committee and the American people that if adversaries challenge us in space, they will face a truly unified national security team. Thank you again, Mr. Vice President and members of this community, for allowing me to update you on these vital reforms which will increase our joint effectiveness and ensure we remain safe in space.
Thank you, gentlemen. Great start. Great start. Excellent report. Next, we're going to go to the Acting Secretary of the Air Force, Matt Donovan, and then I'll ask General Dunford to bring some closing remarks before we move on to our panel. But, Mr. Secretary, thank you. We are on the cusp of the launch of the United States Space Force. It'll be the 6th branch of our armed forces, and let me just say to you and to the whole team at Air Force how grateful we are for the tremendous partnership that you and Secretary Wilson have had in bringing this day about. But, Mr. Secretary, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mr. Vice President, for your chairing this meeting. Your strong leadership has been a unifying voice in the national discussion on space, and it's an honor to represent Secretary Esper and the Department of Defense at today's meeting. Our nation needs the United States Space Force to guarantee our preeminence in the space domain, and it must be a new and separate service to unleash its full potential. As the Congressional Defense Authorizing Committee's conference the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, we need them to take the necessary steps to fully establish the United States Space Force as a separate and fully equal branch of the armed forces within the Department of Defense. Although the current House and Senate provisions addressing the administration's proposal differ in several ways, they fundamentally agree on 2 important points. A new organization is required to retain American dominance in space, and it will reside within the Department of the Air Force. A key component to this effort is reforming Title X of the United States Code. This will provide the necessary legal authority for the Space Force to organize, train, and equip ready forces for our warfighting combatant commanders. Without modification to Title X, the current legislative provisions do not provide all the necessary authorities to establish a separate service in the 6th branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. The Department is fully engaged with the Defense Authorizing Committees to ensure that the final NDAA language explicitly includes the United States Space Force as an armed force with the necessary authorities in Title X, and thereby codifying it alongside its sister services in this bedrock law. While this new service will reside within the Department of the Air Force, it does not mean that it is solely an Air Force effort. Each service has its own cadre of space experts with a keen sense of how space affects their unique domains, and they should be given the opportunity to contribute to this important event in our history. To be truly effective, the United States Space Force must integrate with the larger national security space effort and collaborate across the whole of government, as Director McGuire mentioned. We will do this by first consolidating the DoD's finest space professionals and uniting them under a common service with a common mission. As part of this effort, last spring, the Department of Defense established the Space Development Agency. Using streamlined acquisition authorities and a focus on rapid development, the Space Development Agency is poised to synchronize the development and fielding of new military space capabilities. In fact, the Space Development Agency recently held its first Industry Day as it seeks public-private partnerships to incorporate commercial innovation and technologies into the future of national defense space architecture. This agility and responsiveness will be hallmarks of the United States Space Force, which is why it is critical to transition the Space Development Agency into the new service after it's established. As you mentioned, Mr. Vice President, in the coming days, the administration will formally stand up the United States Space Command, the warfighting command responsible for military space operations. Fully supported by the Congress, who unanimously confirmed as first Commander General Raymond, the U.S. Space Command will be charged with defending our critical space assets from the increasing threats posed by potential adversaries, while providing crucial space operations support to military operations on land, in the air, and at sea. Ladies and gentlemen, now is an exciting time for America's future in space. The United States Space Force will be a 21st century service designed for the information age. We are committed to building a flat, agile, and rapid organization that will be the pathfinder for a modern military service. We will continue to work closely with the Congress to bring this historic establishment to reality in a reasonable, responsible, and most importantly, effective manner. The Department of Defense is ready, the Department of the Air Force is ready, and America is ready for the United States Space Force. We must act now to ensure we retain our technological and military advantage in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Great report. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for your leadership as the Acting Secretary. Thank you for representing the Secretary of Defense here and for your tremendous, and the Air Force, tremendous collaboration on this historic endeavor, which is, I want to amplify one point that the Acting Director National Intelligence pointed out, that essentially both China and Russia have established their own space forces in recent years. And it underscores President Trump's vision and the imperative of making that vision a reality. And we're grateful for your strong partnership. No one to whom we are more grateful than the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I have asked him to simply reflect on this broad topic, but also General Dunford, thank you again for your active participation in the launch of the United States Space Force and for your tremendous leadership of the Joint Chiefs. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, ladies and gentlemen. The Vice President and Secretary Donovan spoke about the Space Force. This initiative is going to have a positive impact on our ability to grow the people and the capabilities that we're going to need in the future. And like Secretary Donovan, I'm confident that the focus that a single service will bring to bear on space is going to have a profound difference. As Vice President Pence mentioned in his opening remarks, we'll also establish the United States Space Command next week on the 29th of August. And when the Vice President presides over the ceremony, we will immediately assign 87 units under a single combatant commander. This step will put us on a path to maintain a competitive advantage and as Vice President Pence described this, and as the President's described it, in this critical warfighting domain. When General Raymond assumes command, he's going to bring together capabilities that include missile warning, satellite operations, space control, and space support. Mr. Vice President, members of the Council, the direction is clear. We understand it, and we're moving out.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the panel to come forward. We're going to move quickly through the balance of the program this morning, but members of the panel, please make your way to the stage. Our first panelist is Rex Javadin. He's President and CEO of BWX. He's going to speak to us about the uses of nuclear power in space. But he's here also because he's a 17-year veteran of NASA and was served as a Chief Operating Officer. And Rex, it's great to have you here. Our second panelist, Dr. Clive Neal, will provide an overview of lunar resources. He's a professor of planetary geology at the University of Notre Dame in the great state of Indiana. And he's, thank you, somebody said go Irish out there, I think. But he's also helped train our current class of NASA astronauts. And Dr. Neal, we're grateful. Grateful that you are here. Thank you so much. Third panelist is Dr. Sarah Lynn Mark, who will be speaking to us as, frankly, a world-renowned leader in women's health, an author, a professor, has been an advisor to NASA and HHS and Office of Science and Technology, and as we launch the Artemis mission, as the administrator said, with this what is today a diverse core of astronauts that we will send to the moon and Mars. We're grateful to have Dr. Mark's reflections here about some of the human factors in space flight. And finally, rounding out the panel is Dr. Elizabeth Tartle, a planetary scientist with Johns Hopkins. She's going to share space-driven innovations in human robotic exploration efforts He's participated in the Galileo mission to Jupiter, the Cassini mission to Saturn, and Dr. Turtle, I want to offer congratulations to you on the selection of the Dragonfly mission. Join me in welcoming this outstanding panel. It's a terrific group of Americans. Thank you all. Let me start with Rex Javadin, and to each of the panelists, just know that we will submit your remarks in their entirety for the record, but we'd ask you to maybe keep your remarks to 3 minutes or so we can move through it quickly and maybe get to some questions, which oftentimes is more informative at these National Space Council meetings. But Rex, you're recognized, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President and distinguished members of the National Space Council, I'm deeply honored to speak before you today. I'm here to talk about the application of nuclear power systems in space and the confluence of advanced technologies that will enable nuclear power systems to be a key capability of our nation's robust space exploration program. As you well know, NASA has been using plutonium-based nuclear batteries in space for decades to power such things as scientific spacecraft and autonomous rovers, but my discussion today will focus on much higher power, yet compact nuclear reactors that can power entire spaceships, large vehicles, and human space settlements. BWXT, the company that I lead, has a 6-decade history of supporting U.S. space exploration programs and designing and manufacturing nuclear reactors for military and civilian applications. We've manufactured and delivered over 300 such reactors. As it happens, I also served as the Vice President said, for 17 years at NASA, concluding my career there as the Associate Administrator, overseeing the full portfolio of projects in human spaceflight, exploration, technology demonstrations, and science. What I learned at NASA and what I have seen at BWXT is that America has the nuclear technological capabilities right now to push the boundaries of human exploration at the moon and further onto Mars. Many space exploration and operations problems require that high-density power be available at all times or on call, and there is a class of such problems for which nuclear power is the preferred, if not the only solution. Technology is rapidly evolving to make relatively low-cost nuclear reactors that are not just attractive alternatives to space power options, but also the means to accomplish things that were not possible before. For example, BWXT has been working with NASA on a nuclear thermal propulsion system that would propel a spacecraft from Earth's orbit to Mars. This system has a number of advantages over other designs and would contribute to significantly shorter travel times and lower exposure to cosmic radiation for astronauts. In fact, today, there is no better option to safely deliver humans to Mars in time to protect their health. Additionally, the development of compact reactors for space creates collateral benefits for U.S. national security. Nuclear energy is a compelling solution for off-grid secure power for forward or remote military bases. We also envision classes of highly compact reactors that could be used in asset protection and very high-power defense systems. We're able to bring such technologies forth now because of advanced manufacturing techniques that are progressing in the United States faster than ever. For example, we are developing 3D printing capabilities at BWXT to manufacture metal components that could radically improve the economics and delivery timeline for nuclear reactors. In closing, I would point out that since the dawn of spaceflight, we have encountered the problems of power and propulsion. Spacecraft must be propelled efficiently, and every system, life support, habitation, scientific instruments, rovers, and so on, requires electricity. Historically, limitations in both propulsion and power have curtailed mission scope, scale, speed, and duration. If we are to fulfill the objectives in President Trump's first space policy directive to establish a long-term presence on the moon and send the first crewed mission to Mars, nuclear power is arguably the most important technology to enable these bold national goals. Given technological advances and our nation's renewed interest in space exploration, there has never been a better time to employ nuclear systems in space. I thank you for your interest in this technology, and I look forward to your questions.
Give Rex a round of applause. That's great. Great summary. Thank you. Thank you. Great comments, and particularly provocative on the importance of nuclear power when we talk about long-term missions.
Thank you.
Not just to the moon, but to Mars. Dr. Clive Neal, on lunar resources is recognized. And thank you again, Rex, for keeping to about 3 minutes. I really do want to get to questions. But Dr. Neal, thank you again.
I'm probably going to blow this, but Mr. Vice President, Administrator Bridenstine, members of the Space Council, ladies and gentlemen, I'm from the University of Notre Dame, but the Vice President's probably already guessed that from my Northern Indiana accent. I'm deeply honored to be talking to you today about Lunar In Situ Resource Utilization, or ISRU. The time is now right to take a giant leap by using the moon to learn how to live off the land, thus enabling sustained human presence off Earth while stimulating a new sector of our economy. As we look forward to the moon, we need to learn from history. Apollo was a monumental achievement, and last month we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. However, Apollo showed us how not to conduct human space exploration because such a program based upon international competition is not sustainable. This is demonstrated by the fact that 2019 also marks 47 years since the last human walked on the moon. Therefore, in order to have an enduring, sustainable, multi-decadal human space exploration program, two things are required. First, we should choose to go to the moon with our international and commercial partners in a spirit of cooperation. This will allow the build-up of assets on the lunar surface so we can learn how to live and work productively off-planet in preparation for the exploration of Mars. Second, space exploration must deliver a return on the taxpayer investment, such that the budget of our space agency is viewed as an investment in the future of this country. Nevertheless, the moon and the Moon to Mars program has been interpreted, at least by some, to be a stepping stone or a box to check on the way to Mars. But lunar resources can be enabling by maintaining human life, growing a base of operations, stimulating a cislunar economy through job growth, and making journeys to destinations beyond affordable and sustainable. This requires a permanent human presence on the moon that will create a demand for lunar resource products. For what are lunar resources? They can be subdivided into those that can be used in situ and those for export. In situ resources include polar water ice and other water-yielding lunar resources. Bulk regolith can be used for 3D printing of lunar habitats and refined for oxygen, titanium, silicon, etc. Resources that are potential off-moon exports include rocket fuel from lunar water, beaming of solar power back to Earth, platinum group and rare earth metals, and helium-3, which is a potential fuel for nuclear fusion, yielding no toxic byproducts. China is very interested in this. However, in the ISRU discussion, the term resource has been used when reserve is what is meant. A resource is a geologic commodity that exists, but its extent is a best estimate. A reserve is a subgroup of a resource that is a known size, composition, and can be extracted economically. Therefore, the most immediate and vital issue for lunar ISRU is defining if resources are actually reserves, and so are economically viable. Mobile surface assets are critically needed to map out the area, vertical extent, concentration, and composition of any resource. Note that prospecting is not done at just one location. It is conducted at several in order to find the best places for infrastructure investment. Thus, geologic prospecting on the moon needs to be a campaign that cross-cuts through NASA's mission directorates. The Artemis program of record goes beyond the camping trips of Apollo, focusing on increasingly longer human stays at one location, leading to the establishment of a permanent lunar surface base of operations. A field station at the South Pole by 2028 is a goal of this program, so having the capability of resource extraction before then will be vital. The field station will require local resources to sustainably develop, expand, and maintain it. So development of local resources will allow humanity to survive and thrive on the moon and beyond. However, based upon the initial findings from the Lunar ISRU workshop in July, not knowing if the resources are reserves, coupled with the lack of markets for products from such resources, are preventing any commercial mining involvement. NASA can provide these much-needed data and create markets for the resource products. Water is a resource at many localities throughout the solar system. In fact, water is the oil of the solar system in terms of fuel for interplanetary spacecraft using liquid oxygen hydrogen engines. Therefore, development of destination-agnostic water ISRU capabilities means no new systems are required when we go to Mars and beyond. In summary, bringing the moon into our economic sphere of influence will benefit society on Earth, create a new sector of our economy, and reinforce the United States leadership in space exploration. I look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you so very much. And Dr. Sarah Lynn Mark is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, members of the National Space Council, and distinguished guests, thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. Gender and sex impact every aspect of our lives on Earth and in space. It's more than spacesuits not fitting female astronauts. We see the impact from the shoes and clothing we wear, the electronic devices we use, the cars we drive in, and even the medications we take. Modifying appearances or the pink-it-shrink-it approach for gendered innovation will never work in any environment, including space, battlefields, hot zones, and in our homes. The National Academy of Medicine defines gender as a person's self-representation as male or female based upon social interactions, and sex is based upon one's genes. We now know that the environment can modify gene expression, which is called epigenetics, thus the definitions are more nuanced. Men and women adapt to space differently, where even small differences significantly impact the quality and safety of life, including astronaut work performance. It is imperative that NASA and its commercial space partners address these differences in how they plan and conduct missions, how they develop products such as spacesuits, high-performance clothing, including liquid cooling and ventilation garments, tools, hardware, and machine-human interfaces, and how they establish extravehicular activity or EVA training protocols and medical guidelines for countermeasures and precision medicine. In several reports from the National Academy of Sciences, it was recommended that NASA fully evaluate and address the influence that gender and sex have on the physiological and psychological changes that occur during spaceflight. In response, NASA launched 2 decadal reviews assessing the impact of gender and sex on adaptation to space in 2002 and in 2012. Every system in the body changes in the microcosm of space. For example, it has been observed that some male and female astronauts experience spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS, in which there is visual impairment and increased intracranial pressure. Interestingly, the signs and symptoms are more severe in male astronauts. Orthostatic intolerance, or the inability to stand without fainting, is more prevalent upon landing in female astronauts than in their male counterparts. Additionally, radiation presents a major hazard for space travel. It has been reported that female subjects are more susceptible to radiation-induced cancer than male subjects. Hence, permissible exposure limits for radiation are lower for women than men astronauts, which could impact their ability to participate in long-duration space flights. I want to be crystal clear. This is not about who is faster, better, or smarter, just different. We have the capability to develop the tools and resources to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to live and work well and safely on Earth and in space. Most of us in this room were influenced by the Apollo program. The Apollo effect changed the direction of our careers and the course of our lives. We need to ensure that there will be an Artemis effect. I want to believe that the next boots on the lunar surface will be worn by a woman, and not only will they fit her, but they will also inspire the next generation of explorers. It is time to see the world through a gender-sex lens. When we achieve this goal, we are taking a major leap toward mission success for everyone that will enhance space exploration and our daily lives on Earth. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Great comments. And Dr. Elizabeth Turtle, and then we'll go to questions as time permits. Doctor?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, members of the Council, and distinguished guests. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss some of NASA's next steps in robotic planetary exploration. Science, technology, and the very human desire to explore uncharted territory have driven innovation since time immemorial. This is best demonstrated by NASA's history of innovation for the purpose of exploration beyond our Earth and even beyond our solar system. While there are many exploration innovations we could discuss, given its recent selection as the Next New Frontiers mission and my role as principal investigator and the limited time, I will focus on the example of the Dragonfly mission to Saturn's moon Titan. Our entire team is excited to be on a path to explore an extraterrestrial world, complete with lakes, mountains, clouds, and even rain, with a spacecraft derived from the drones that have become ubiquitous here on Earth. in search of the building blocks of life. Indeed, it is the opportunity to work on projects like this that inspired so many of us to pursue careers in science and engineering in the first place. For the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Dragonfly is the latest chapter in a story that began shortly after World War II, when on a mission led for the Defense Department, the very first picture of the Earth from space was taken from a V-2 rocket. I point out the partnership with the Defense Department in that first milestone to highlight the synergies that are possible, indeed essential, when it comes to space innovation. The space community has benefited from the investments made not only through NASA, but also through the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and innovations from the private sector. The benefits go both ways. Our space exploration investments have also furthered education and the technologies leveraged for the nation's economy and security. Dragonfly is an example of a mission that involves multiple scientific and engineering disciplines, working across boundary lines within and between government agencies and institutions, NASA centers, industry, and universities, as well as across international borders. The investigations Dragonfly is designed to pursue will help transform our understanding of the chemical reactions that may have led to life here on Earth. Upon arrival in 2034, Dragonfly is designed to take advantage of Titan's thick atmosphere, which combined with relatively low gravity make Titan ideal for flight. In fact, it takes 38 times less power to fly there than here on Earth. Put another way, a human being would only need to put on a pair of wings to fly above the surface of Titan. Thanks to the considerable recent development in drone technologies, Dragonfly will be the first radioisotope-powered vehicle to conduct aerial exploration of another world. A critical point is that while Dragonfly provides a novel concept and architecture for ocean world exploration, the design leverages prior technology investments and development in order to minimize costs and mitigate risk. Because of this, we frequently say that Dragonfly demonstrates the power of innovative application of technology. It was especially appropriate that Dragonfly was selected during the 50th anniversary year of Apollo 11. Along with this administration's public support of going to Mars and back to the moon, this historic commemoration has rekindled interest in space exploration across the country. Interest that will be stoked again when Dragonfly lands on Titan and begins transmitting images and data from this alien world. Dragonfly also provides a crucial link between the teams that designed, built, and operated previous missions and the next generation of technologists who will be ready to take the next steps in space innovation as we enter the middle decades of the 21st century. In closing, the interdisciplinary nature of missions like Dragonfly, bridging diverse scientific and technical fields, exemplify the kind of innovation that has been at the heart of NASA's robotic exploration of the solar system and beyond. In this way, NASA develops new technological capabilities, investigates new horizons, and inspires the next generation of explorers. Our thanks again for this historic opportunity, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Turtle. Thank you. Thanks for your leadership. And I think we can all tell that we tapped the right team for Dragonfly mission. So thank you very much for your insight and enthusiasm. I'm going to go to several members of the panel with questions, and we'll start with Administrator Bridenstine. And to those in attendance or looking on, we'll go till about 10 minutes before the hour. So we'll keep our questions very brief, our answers as brief as possible. But also I want to remind the panel, if you want to add all of the record of this meeting and the National Space Council is made available publicly. If you want to submit additional materials in writing, we will publish them in like manner. So with that, Mr. Administrator.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. One thing I'd like to note before I ask my question is Dr. Clive Neal here is our lunar resource expert on the panel. Also in the audience, we have Chris Carberry. Now, these two gentlemen, you've got a moon guy, Mr. Vice President, and we have a Mars guy. And I will tell you, a couple years ago, you put those two in the same room, it was not going to be a pretty sight. But now we've got this new direction, moon and Mars. And now when they come and visit me, they come together. which I never thought I'd see. But it's a thrilling thing for our nation, and to see the unity between these two gentlemen.
But it's still not that pretty.
It's still not that pretty. I had a question for Rex. We talk about radioisotope thermal generation, the ability to basically use nuclear decay to create heat and use the heat to create electricity. Tremendously valuable. We've been using it for years. You're talking about something else. You're talking about actually using nuclear fission for propulsion. That is absolutely a game changer for what NASA is trying to achieve. Propulsion hasn't changed. You've got a mass and you need to accelerate it. And when we use nuclear fission, you can heat hydrogen to levels that make it exceptionally fast. And so that mass is accelerated faster than we could otherwise accelerate it. That gives us opportunity to really protect life. When we talk about the radiation dose, when we travel between Earth and Mars, can you share with us how much time do you think we could save in that travel between Earth and Mars if we had nuclear thermal propulsion?
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. The nuclear thermal engines that we talk about are about twice as efficient as chemical engines, and they're actually simpler for a variety of reasons. The transit time to Mars for a typical chemical rocket engine when Mars is at its closest approach to Earth is about 6 or 7 months, as you know. With the nuclear thermal propulsion system, we anticipate being able to get a crew to Mars in about 3 or 4 months, about half the time. And you can see those same kind of economies and efficiencies for scientific exploration as well.
So, and then the next question for you would be other applications. It's not just for reducing the radiation dose for humans flying through deep space, but also national security implications. How do we maneuver within low Earth orbit or cislunar orbits so that ultimately we can move quickly to various spots based on the threats that we heard about today? There's many applications here that benefit not just human exploration, but also national security. Am I correct?
That's correct, Mr. Administrator. We anticipate that this kind of technology could also be used in a variety of national security applications. And I mentioned in my remarks, for example, off-grid power for forward or remote military bases. You certainly can imagine using a compact high-temperature gas reactor to power a directed energy weapon, for example, using diesel fuel now, but that's not sustainable over a sustained battle.
Real quick, for that directed energy weapon, could that be used, for example, to protect Earth from an asteroid?
I think you could envision that for planetary protection as well. It's possible to put high amounts of laser energy on an asteroid, whatever threat you're concerned about, and so it's a possible technology for that as well.
Could it be used to take debris out of orbit?
It could be used for taking debris out of orbit. People talk about using laser energy to change the trajectory of space debris, and it's a very possible application for that as well.
I think, Mr. Vice President, there's an amazing opportunity here that the United States of America should take advantage of.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thanks. Great comments. With that, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross for a question.
Dr. Neal, what's the biggest challenge that you faced in training the current class of astronauts?
The biggest challenge is educating them in the limited time we have for if they're going to the moon, about the moon. Trying to make them understand about the environment. You don't really know until you go there. I've never been. I've studied it a lot. But I think the biggest challenge is actually having time with the astronauts to teach them about off-world exercises and how they would then maximize their time on the surface of the moon or Mars.
And what do you see as the biggest challenge going from habitation of the moon to getting to Mars?
Well, again, I think it comes back to actually getting to Mars. I think we can learn about living and working productively off-planet on the moon and take those lessons to another hostile environment for human life. I think they'll translate quite well. There will be nuanced differences, but I still think that the journey and what we just heard is one way to try and mitigate some of those risks by going faster. But that journey is going to be the issue. I think we have a laboratory in our back garden. We need to make good use of it, not only for economic benefit, but also for training to go beyond there. It's an off-world laboratory that will prepare humans very well for exploring destinations beyond the moon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wilbur. Next, we'll go to the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Keith Kroc. Keith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Dr. Tuttle, I have a question for you because you've spent so much time in space diplomacy over your career. And it's really this, as we develop and operationalize our global economic security strategy integrated into our national security strategy platform, the space industry is a top priority. And so I'd be interested in your view in terms of how does the United States maintain its leadership position and collaborate with our allies and their private sector partners and safeguard our IP and our know-how through global trusted frameworks and some of the things maybe you've worked on over the years?
Absolutely. There's so much to be gained from these kinds of partnerships, and at the same time to balance that with sharing of information, and that's an area where we take very seriously in these international partnerships, and something that we need to coordinate very carefully as we move forward. But it is so, as so many of these international missions have demonstrated, the potential of those collaborations is so valuable that it's something that is worth investing the effort in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And let the chairman ask the final question. Dr. Mark, women are an indispensable part of the astronaut corps of NASA, and you've been a great advisor along the way. You spoke today about some of the challenges that the differences among the sexes make, opportunities for one versus the other. We've set the objective to have women and men leading America back in human space exploration, that the first woman and the next man on the moon will be an American, and we'll send men and women to Mars. You've spoken about some of the differences. Are there also, can you give us some examples of the benefits as well about having men and women leading in space exploration, and what that means to the science and to expanding American leadership and capabilities?
Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President, for your question. I think it comes down to issues of diversity and inclusion. And if we can take it back to even on Earth, we see that diversified workforces have optimal team performance. Sometimes it takes a little bit of effort up front to make sure people are communicating and sharing knowledge, but we do see improvement at the end of the day. I think what we have seen is that we will have a mixed crew. American women are the taxpayers. They are supporting this program. They need to be represented. And additionally, the lessons that we learned from the space program have extraordinary value for how we live our lives on Earth. We need to represent that. I really believe it's time for NASA, as well as all agencies and organizations, to ensure that their programs and policies have a focus on human systems integration using a gender-sex lens.
It's so wonderfully well said, and it is the reality at NASA today. We have on our user advisory group, we have some extraordinarily distinguished female astronauts who've logged hundreds of hours in space exploration. But I just want to thank you for your contributions to understanding. We have opportunities to really celebrate that diversity. But also it's imperative, if I hear you right, that NASA and our private sector partners continue to lean in clear-eyed and account for the unique differences and challenges that men and women face in space exploration. I pledge to you that we will do just that.
Thank you very much.
Okay. How about a round of applause for this whole panel? This is a remarkable group of Americans. Great job. With that, with the time is of a little scarce, and so I trust that members of the National Space Council have reviewed the recommendations that have been presented to meet the President's objective on human space exploration and also encouraging and promoting private sector innovation. As those looking on in the public will note, these include specific timelines for reforms of workforce, acquisition rules, management, and industrial base issues. They also create opportunities for international and commercial partnerships, and I recommend to the public's attention the public record, but you will find that we are setting specific timelines for the administrator in the next 60 days to the designation of an office and submission of a plan for sustainable lunar surface exploration and the development of crewed missions to Mars. The next council meeting, a plan to report on the technologies and capabilities necessary to implement sustainable lunar surface exploration. And there are other very specific goals for NASA, and we'll thank the administrator in advance for continuing to move out on those directives. We'll also be recommending that NASA facilitate the development of commercial and public-private successors to the International Space Station and set a timeline for the Department of Commerce on the authorization of commercial space operations not currently regulated by any other federal agency. And complementary to our commercialization of the International Space Station, the staff will present the Council members a Moon to Mars development strategy. One of my takeaways today is Dr. Clive Neal's use of the term prospector to describe activities on the lunar surface and on Mars, and it brings to mind the Old West, and it's just exactly how we ought to be thinking about ensuring that we're developing the resources of space and giving taxpayers a return on investment, as you said so well. But we'll be calling for a Moon to Mars development strategy that will take in all the technological capabilities that we have, and also the director will be presenting the National Space Council with a plan to modernize the workforce. With that, if all those in favor of endorsing these recommendations by the National Space Council signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the recommendations will be forwarded by the unanimous decision of the National Space Council. And I'll be discussing these recommendations with the President later today, and we'll be forwarding them to agencies at the President's direction. With that, let me simply close by saying thank you to all the members of the National Space Council, the members of our user advisory group, and invite the crowd to join me in thanking these incredible Americans for their contribution to American leadership in space. It's a great job. I also want to thank Rex Javaden, Dr. Clive Neal, Dr. Sarah Lynn Mark, and Dr. Elizabeth Turtle for a tremendous contribution to this discussion today, and your testimony today and your written testimony will continue to inform our work. So join me in thanking our panel one more time. America is leading in space once again. Thanks to the vision and the leadership of President Donald Trump, we have redoubled our commitment to lead on behalf of human exploration with NASA at the tip of the spear, to engage our private sector partners to work in new and in renewed ways with the American people to advance American leadership. And with the President's direction as Commander-in-Chief, we are reorganizing our commitment to provide for the common defense and developing the United States Space Force, the U.S. Space Command, and to develop the technologies to protect this nation going forward. I know, looking out at this crowd, and I know to those looking on, there's tremendous enthusiasm for President Trump's leadership in space. But I ask only today that those of you who share this passion for renewed American leadership in space, go tell the story. It's exciting to be here at the Smithsonian. We have made a point, now this being the 6th meeting of the National Space Council, to travel. And our objective is to help relight the imagination of the American people for this space program. 50 years is a long time. I know what I'm talking about. But our determination is to capture the imagination of the American people, of men and women and boys and girls all across this country, and really to inspire the world. And so I encourage each and every one of you, and maybe it'll be assisted if before you leave here today, if you take a long stroll through this historic place, if you look at these tremendous remnants of American leadership in space. But I just want to challenge each and every one of you, industry leaders who are here, those that are looking on, educators and public servants, is go tell the story. And go tell the story of American leadership in space. Tell the story not just to those who represent you in Washington, D.C., and to leaders at every level, but tell the story in your communities, in your state, and all across this nation. And I know with your energetic support, with President Donald Trump's leadership and vision, with this extraordinary team that he has assembled, the work of NASA, and with God's help, America will lead mankind into the vast expanse of space. So thank you very much, and God bless you.